You need to sort of put it back and see it from the British point of view. So since the 1950s, Britain has designed its entire foreign policy and defence policy around the United States. Essentially, Britain around the world has tried to find out what the US is doing and do it at a slightly smaller scale alongside the United States. Everything's designed around the United States. So we went into Iraq with the United States, we went into Afghanistan with the United States, and of course we lost hundreds of lives in Afghanistan fighting an American counterinsurgency warfare strategy, and every one of our generals and every one of our politicians and diplomats was out there repeating the lines from the George Bush administration and the Obama administration about why Afghanistan was so incredibly important. Repeating to our own grieving parents of dead soldiers the US analysis, which was that this was a threat to global security, that we needed to do this, that it was important to defeat the Taliban, that we had a moral obligation to Afghan women, and we were going to stick the course. And throughout that whole period, the United States was very flattering to Britain. Right? When it suits the United States, they're very good at saying, oh, you're absolutely critical to us. We're so grateful for you coming along with us. All these lives you're losing in Helmand make a huge difference to the effort. We really care about you. But at the moment of departure, the US wants to get out, and it appears to forget that it had any partners on the ground at all. There was no real attempt to include Britain in any of these conversations. And through the manner of the departure, the US seems to indicate that this entire story of a partnership or relationship was nonsense. When it suited the US to get a coalition behind it, it could be as charming as it wanted. But when it wanted to leave, any attempt to reach out to other countries and say, do you really think this is sensible? If we're leaving, is there any way that you could fill the gap that we're leaving behind? Can we provide some enablers behind you? 2,500 soldiers is not very many to ask NATO to keep behind when the US leaves. Can we facilitate that in some way? Those conversations were entirely lacking. And as I say, Biden didn't even bother to pick up the telephone to Prime Minister Johnson for 48 hours after Kabul fell. And so that means that if you're Britain, the next time the US is saying, you know, we really want you with us and we want you taking all these lives and risks and political costs because we want you to believe in the American confidence, the consistency of an American vision, America's commitment to its alliances, its moral obligation to people around the world, people are going to be a little bit skeptical.
Over the last year, since President Biden has become president, it's not like he hasn't reached out to the UK or tried to rebuild the transatlantic relationship. Whether you're talking about trying to get back into the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA, the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accord, IMF and START, nuclear agreements. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, even the alternative minimum tax and the G7 summit in Cornwall, which wasn't so long ago, actually felt, I mean, I wouldn't say it was a smashing success, but it certainly felt both convivial and stable as a meeting of America's closest allies. So I wonder how much of this you think is the heat of the disappointment and the human pain and suffering of today, as opposed to the real lasting damage to what has been the most important U.S. ally out there for many, many decades.
Ian, yes, I think that's a good challenge that you've made there. Definitely there are things that are going right. I think what this has demonstrated is not that the Biden administration is somehow unreliable or impossible to work with. What it's demonstrated is that the Biden administration doesn't have any consistent vision of a defense policy. It's certainly a reliable ally if you wish to go along with it on Paris climate talks. It's certainly worth talking to about the World Health Organization. Things that don't involve any form of US military intervention or involvement, the Biden administration is fine on. But the challenge for the United Kingdom and other NATO allies is that's fundamentally a military alliance. And what's been broken through this Afghan horror is any sense of what the future shape of our armed forces should be, whether we're actually ever going to go on military operations again, whether there's any remaining vision of intervention which the West can sign up to, whether we're up for playing a role as a global policeman at all, or whether the US is going to hope that it can resort to being a sort of, resort to the alibi of international conferences and international organizations but take itself entirely out of the critical role that the United States has played for the last 70 years, which is having its own defense policy.
So this is a somewhat unfair question, but you're the right person to ask it to. In terms of the U.S.-UK relationship going forward, which do you think has done more damage? The U.S. unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan without engaging the Brits, or Brexit?
I would say they're both very damaging. I mean, clearly Brexit was a deep, deep disillusioning moment for the United States. But they are different in nature. Brexit was something driven by domestic British political issues. Afghanistan was different. Afghanistan was an international defense security choice, which wasn't particularly caught up in presidential elections or referenda or any of this stuff. Once the decision had been made to hold a referendum on Brexit, right, which was a very bad mistake that was made, I think, probably. I don't know. I mean, we can go back and forth with that. But once that decision was made and once people had voted to leave, it was very difficult to work out what on earth the British government was supposed to do when the majority of people had been promised a referendum and they'd voted in a particular direction. Brexit from then onwards seemed pretty inevitable. This is a different sort of feeling. I mean, this is going to something that's a bit more awkward, which is that since the end of the Second World War, throughout the Cold War, throughout the 90s, throughout the 2000s, the United States has, for better or worse, played this very significant international role as a sort of global policeman and called on allies like the United Kingdom to reinforce it. What we're seeing now under Trump and Biden is a new age, and it's an age unmistakably the most isolationist age that we've seen from the United States in terms of foreign military involvement since the pre-Second World War period. And it's a very, very awkward, odd moment. I mean, we can rebuild from it, but it's been a very shattering, disappointing moment. I mean, I and many, many others who are in the centre ground of British politics were incredibly pleased at President Biden's election. I mean, just from a personal point of view, we're all being mocked in the British press because we were all out there saying, you know, this is extraordinary, this is the most amazing inaugural address, we're so excited, this is a new dawn for the relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. And as you can imagine, pretty much every other centre-left or centre-right politician is now being mocked for the fact that Biden has just done this to us.